We often hear that the only way to break a narcissist's power is to disappear, to go no contact, to remove yourself completely from their world. But what if I told you that distance alone isn't what truly breaks them? What if the real shift, the one that dismantles their control faster, isn't about vanishing at all, but about changing the one thing they depend on most, your emotional response? Narcissists don't fear losing you. They fear losing the ability to influence your thoughts, your reactions, and your sense of self. The moment you stop feeding that system, the moment you step out of the role they scripted for you, something inside them starts to fracture. This speech isn't about punishing them. It's about understanding how their psychology works and reclaiming the power they were never meant to hold over you in the first place. Let's break down how you do that. Not by disappearing, but by becoming emotionally unreachable, even when you're right in front of them. The first key idea centers on the narcissist's deepest fear, losing psychological control. This fear runs far deeper than the fear of losing you as a person. Narcissists form relationships not to connect, but to control. And when that control begins to weaken, it destabilizes their entire sense of self. They depend on the emotional reactions of others to regulate their own fragile identity. Every sigh, every argument, every attempt to explain yourself, every emotional expression you offer becomes fuel that confirms they still matter, that they still have influence, that they still occupy mental space within you. This is why they can tolerate distance more easily than they can tolerate emotional indifference. Distance still leaves the door open for fantasy. In your absence, they can rewrite the narrative and imagine you longing for them, suffering without them, or waiting for their return. But when you are present and no longer emotionally responsive, when you stop feeding the dynamic that gives them their power, they lose their grip. It confronts them with the truth they work so hard to avoid. They are not as influential, admirable, or essential as they believe themselves to be. Losing psychological control exposes the hollowness beneath their grandiosity. It forces them to face the reality that they cannot control your emotions, that their charm no longer works, that their manipulation no longer sticks. This loss threatens the identity they've carefully constructed. Narcissists survive on the illusion that they are powerful, desirable, and irreplaceable. When your emotional world stops orbiting around their behavior, that illusion breaks. You are not just slipping away, you are slipping out of their psychological universe. This is where the injury lies. They experience your emotional neutrality as rejection, and rejection triggers a deep internal panic, one they cannot regulate without external validation. They may respond with anger, guilt tactics, love bombing, or victim playing because they are scrambling to regain the emotional control that once kept them steady. The fear of losing control is rooted in the reality that narcissists cannot regulate their own self-worth from within. Their sense of value is borrowed from the reactions, admiration, and attention of others. When you are no longer reactive, no longer available to mirror their superiority or absorb their frustrations, you become a psychological threat. Not because you are doing anything aggressive, but because you are doing nothing at all. Silence is tolerable, but emotional detachment is unbearable. Your neutrality does not leave them with space to fantasize. It leaves them with a mirror they can't handle. That mirror shows them their own insignificance in your emotional world, and that realization breaks them faster than distance ever could. The second key idea focuses on the power of emotional neutrality and why it is far more destabilizing to a narcissist than disappearing through no contact. No contact removes you physically, but it does not necessarily remove your emotional energy from the situation. You may still think about them, react internally, or wonder what they're doing. While they can't see that directly, they can still reassure themselves with fantasies, assumptions, and projections. They often tell themselves stories like, they're still obsessed with me, or they'll come back when they calm down. In other words, when you vanish, they fill the silence with narratives that protect their ego. But emotional neutrality doesn't give them the space to create those comforting stories because neutrality is observable. It is calm, consistent, and indifferent in a way that denies them the emotional charge they depend on. Narcissists feed off emotional reactions, positive or negative, admiration, praise, anger, arguments, pleading, crying, defending yourself. All of these reactions confirm to them that they still matter. They do not care whether the energy is loving or frustrated, they only care that it exists. Emotional neutrality removes that fuel source entirely. When you respond in a flat, measured way, when nothing they say provokes you, when their chaos no longer shifts your mood or behavior, something inside them begins to crack. They cannot understand why they are no longer able to produce emotional movement in you. This lack of impact threatens their sense of superiority, and it quietly reveals their lack of power. Narcissists have a psychological need to feel in control of how others feel and react, and neutrality strips them of that illusion. Emotional neutrality is powerful because it is unpredictable to them. They are accustomed to controlling others through provoking reactions, by creating confusion, guilt, fear, or excitement. They expect to push your buttons and receive the same familiar responses. When you stop responding that way, you break the pattern they rely on to feel stable. They feel exposed, irrelevant, and unimportant in your emotional world, and this generates internal panic. They may try harder to provoke you, escalate their behavior, or switch between charm and cruelty, but none of it works when you've emotionally detached. And when nothing works, they're forced to confront the truth they've spent their entire lives avoiding. Their influence is limited, their power is conditional, and their importance is not guaranteed. Neutrality also removes the drama they use as emotional oxygen. Without your reactions, their attempts to bait you feel empty, their manipulations lose effect, and their ego finds no place to latch onto. It is the one response they cannot argue with, guilt trip, or manipulate. It leaves them with nothing to feed on, nothing to interpret, and nothing to control, making it far more shattering than silence alone. The third key idea highlights why maintaining boundaries while remaining present is more psychologically disruptive to a narcissist than disappearing through distance. Narcissists are accustomed to one of two dynamics: full access to you or the dramatic separation that allows them to fantasize, rewrite the narrative, and protect their ego. When you stay in their line of sight but revoke the privileges they once enjoyed, your time, emotional labor, explanations, reassurance, patience, and flexibility, you introduce a form of accountability they are not equipped to handle. You are visible, but no longer usable. You are present, but no longer controllable. This creates a direct confrontation with their dependency on your emotional compliance, and it dismantles the power structure they've built over time. Boundaries disrupt their sense of entitlement. Narcissists believe they deserve special treatment, automatic forgiveness, and unlimited access to your attention. When you enforce boundaries calmly and consistently, without emotional intensity, they lose the levers they once used to dominate the dynamic. They can no longer rely on guilt, urgency, charm, or intimidation to pull you back into old patterns. Each boundary you set is a reminder that their influence over you is shrinking. And because narcissists measure their worth by how well they can control or affect others, every boundary feels like a personal rejection, even when it's simply a healthy limit. Staying present while holding these boundaries removes the escape hatch they typically rely on. If you went no contact, they could tell themselves that you're overreacting or being dramatic, or that you'll return when your emotions settle. They can spin that story to soothe their ego. But when you are right in front of them, composed and steady, they cannot maintain these illusions. You are disproving their narrative in real time. You're not hysterical. You're not apologizing, and you're not engaging in their emotional traps. You're just not giving them the privileges they once exploited. This creates a type of psychological injury because it exposes their lack of true power. Boundaries also force them into emotional discomfort they cannot regulate internally. They do not have the tools to handle frustration, denial, or delayed gratification. When you remove their access to your emotional energy, they are left alone with their own emptiness. This is intolerable for them. They may escalate, test your limits, or attempt to reassert control through anger or charm, but boundaries with presence continually mirror back to them that those tactics no longer work. And when nothing works, their inflated sense of self begins to collapse. They can't retreat into fantasy, they can't control the narrative, and they can't extract the emotional reactions they crave. Your boundaries become the quiet truth they cannot escape, revealing that their power ends where your self-respect begins. The fourth key idea focuses on how consistent indifference delivers a deeper wound to a narcissist than confrontation, pleading, or even cutting them off. Narcissists depend on emotional engagement from others to uphold their fragile inner world. They need reactions, positive or negative, to confirm that they still have significance, influence, and psychological control. When you stop reacting, when your emotional energy no longer moves in response to their behavior, they experience a kind of ego starvation that is far more painful than physical distance. Indifference removes the fuel they survive on. It tells them, without a single word, that they no longer occupy the central role they believe they deserve in your emotional universe. Indifference is powerful because it offers no emotional payoff. If you argue with them, they feel important. If you defend yourself, they feel superior. If you cry, they feel validated in their impact. If you explain your feelings, they feel in control of the emotional narrative. Even anger or frustration still tells them they matter. Narcissists do not distinguish between positive and negative attention. They only care that they can produce emotional movement. But indifference gives them nothing to work with. It does not provide them with admiration, sympathy, fear, or conflict. It does not soothe them or provoke them. It leaves them suspended, unable to interpret your state or manipulate it. For a narcissist who feeds on emotional clarity and dominance, this is a devastating void. Consistent indifference also reveals that their tactics have lost effectiveness. Narcissists operate from a predictable toolbox: gaslighting, guilt, love bombing, silent treatment, triangulation. These strategies are designed to provoke emotional reactions that reaffirm their power, but indifference renders these tools useless. When you don't respond to their baiting, when their charm no longer impresses you, when their criticism doesn't affect your mood, they confront a reality they cannot tolerate. You have emotionally detached, and their power is slipping. This is destabilizing because they do not possess internal stability. They regulate their self-worth externally through how others react to them. Without your reactions, they feel directionless, less significant, and increasingly insecure. This is why narcissists often escalate when met with indifference. They may become more dramatic, more insulting, more seductive, or more manipulative, desperately trying to extract any emotional reaction. But when indifference remains steady, their strategies begin to collapse. They realize the emotional leverage they once had over you has disappeared. You no longer respond to their highs or their lows, and that unpredictability undermines their sense of superiority. Indifference signals that your internal world is no longer shaped by their behavior. And for a narcissist, that is a form of psychological abandonment that cuts far deeper than physical distance. It forces them to confront their diminished relevance, and that confrontation is what breaks them faster than anything else. The fifth key idea explores what happens when you stop playing the role a narcissist assigned you, and why that collapse of their script injures them more than silence or distance. Narcissists structure every relationship around a psychological role they expect you to fulfill. You might be cast as the caregiver who absorbs their emotions, the admirer who praises them, the scapegoat who takes the blame, the peacekeeper who smooths over conflict, or the compliant partner who bends to their needs. These roles are not chosen by you. They are assigned by them to keep the dynamic predictable, controllable, and centered around their emotional needs. When you step out of that role, even subtly, it disrupts the entire psychological ecosystem they depend on. A narcissist's sense of stability is built on predictability. They need to know how you will respond so they can manipulate, provoke, or extract what they need. When you break the script, when you stop over-explaining, stop absorbing blame, stop chasing closure, stop reacting emotionally, or stop reassuring them, their internal world becomes chaotic. They cannot adapt because their psychological framework is rigid and fragile. They learned long ago that controlling others was the only way to regulate their own fear, insecurity, and inadequacy. So when you stop behaving the way they expect, they lose their emotional compass. Breaking the role threatens their identity. Narcissists see others as extensions of themselves, not as separate human beings with boundaries, feelings, and autonomy. Your role in their story reinforces their self-image: powerful, admired, superior, or innocent. When you stop playing that role, the mirror they use to validate themselves cracks. You are no longer feeding the illusions they depend on to maintain their self-worth. This creates a deep narcissistic injury because they must confront a truth they cannot bear: that their power is conditional, not inherent, and that people can detach from their influence. When you shift out of the assigned role, they lose control of the emotional dynamic. They may try to pull you back by escalating manipulation, love bombing, guilt, or anger. They may accuse you of changing, becoming cold, or being unreasonable. These reactions are not about you. They are about the destabilization they feel inside. They are scrambling to restore the old dynamic because it kept their ego intact. But your refusal to return to that role continually exposes their helplessness. They cannot force you back into it without your emotional cooperation, and that loss of control is intolerable for them. Breaking the role is more powerful than going no contact because it shows them in real time that you are no longer participating in the psychological script that once kept them in control. It reveals that their influence has weakened, their tactics have lost effect, and their narrative no longer defines your behavior. This loss of predictability is what ultimately breaks their sense of dominance and exposes the fragility they work so hard to hide. The sixth key idea examines why accountability, especially silent, steady accountability, breaks a narcissist faster than cutting them off. Narcissists are masters at avoiding responsibility. Their entire psychological system is built on deflecting blame, rewriting narratives, and preserving the illusion that they are always right, always justified, and always the victim. They fear accountability because it forces them to face the very parts of themselves they have spent a lifetime denying: their mistakes, their cruelty, their selfishness, and their emotional immaturity. When you hold them accountable without anger, without long explanations, without emotional activation, you create a mirror they cannot escape from. Silent accountability means you respond with actions instead of emotional reactions. You stop rescuing them from the consequences of their behavior. You no longer soften the truth to avoid conflict. You stop explaining every decision, justifying your boundaries, or trying to convince them to understand your perspective. Instead, you enforce limits, maintain distance when necessary, and make choices that protect your well-being. Narcissists rely on emotional chaos to manipulate the situation. When you don't participate in that chaos, they lose their primary weapon. They have no drama to twist, no reactive energy to feed on, and no emotional distraction to hide behind. This kind of accountability is threatening because it reveals their lack of power. When you calmly follow through on consequences, ending a conversation when they become abusive, refusing to accept blame shifting, declining unreasonable demands, they realize that their usual tactics no longer work. They cannot charm their way out of it, intimidate you, or guilt trip you back into compliance. Silent accountability dismantles the illusion of control they use to maintain their sense of superiority. It confronts them with a truth they cannot tolerate. They do not own your emotions, your decisions, or your boundaries. Being held accountable destabilizes them because they lack the emotional tools to process shame or guilt. Healthy individuals can reflect, apologize, or adjust their behavior. A narcissist cannot. Even the mildest form of accountability triggers deep internal panic because it activates a wound they are psychologically unable to manage. They may react with rage, denial, or victim playing, not because you are wrong, but because the truth feels unbearable. Their identity depends on maintaining a perfect facade, and your accountability, delivered with calm consistency, cracks that facade. Silent accountability also denies them the ability to rewrite the narrative. When you don't argue or emotionally engage, there is nothing they can distort or use against you. Your behavior becomes factual, grounded, and untouchable. Over time, this erodes their ability to control the story or weaponize your emotions. They are left facing the natural consequences of their actions, and that exposure breaks them faster than distance ever could. In the end, breaking a narcissist is not about punishment, revenge, or proving a point. It's about reclaiming the psychological space they once occupied and restoring your own emotional autonomy. You don't have to disappear, you don't have to argue, and you don't have to fight for them to finally feel the collapse of their own facade. What truly dismantles their power is your transformation, your refusal to react, your refusal to play the role they assigned you, your quiet boundaries, your steady neutrality, and your calm accountability. These shifts remove the fuel they depend on, expose the fragility they hide, and force them to confront the truth they fear most. They no longer have influence over your inner world. And when their power over your emotions dissolves, their entire psychological structure begins to fall apart. You walk away with clarity, strength, and self-respect, while they are left alone with the emptiness they've spent their whole lives avoiding. That is the real break, not through distance, but through detachment, not through silence, but through sovereignty, and not through no contact, but through finally choosing yourself.